We are starting off Hosea Chapter 9. Hosea Chapter 9, only 17 verses. I'll start reading there, and I guess I'll stop, I don't know, about verse 6 or 9 or something. And then someone else can take over. Sound okay? Y'all are awake, right? Okay. There was reasons before because of the time change, but we've had a little bit of adjustment to get to it. So I'll be up. It's a wonderful day. A wonderful day to rejoice and praise God. So never mind the first three words that I'm going to mention here in Hosea chapter 9. Do not rejoice, O Israel, with exultation like the nations, for you have played the harlot, forsaking your God. You have loved harlots, earnings on every threshing floor. Threshing floor and winepress will not feed them, and the new wine will fail them. They will not remain in the Lord's land, but Ephraim will return to Egypt, and in Assyria they will eat unclean food. They will not pour out drink offerings of wine to the Lord. Their sacrifices will not please him. Their bread will be like mourner's bread. All who eat of it will be defiled, for their bread will be for themselves alone. It will not enter the house of the Lord. What will you do on the day of the appointed festival, and on the day of the feast of the Lord? For behold, they will go because of destruction. Egypt will gather them up. Memphis will bury them. Weeds will take over their treasures, and silver's thorns will be in their tents. Bless you. Gibeah.
God will remember their wickedness and punish them for their sins. When I found Israel, it was like finding grapes in the desert. When I saw your ancestors, it was like seeing the early fruit on the fig tree. But when they came to Baal, they concentrated themselves to that shameful idol, and became as vile as the thing they loved.
Verse 11, anyone? Thank you all for reading. Thank you for intending to read. Maybe we should raise hands next time or something. I know you did. So Hosea chapter 9 is a new set of commands there in verse 1. Marks the opening of this section and kind of a summary announcement of divine judgment that actually concludes in verse 9. And the tone of this entire section is this threat of judgment by exile that we see here in verse 3, that they will return to Egypt, their feasts have become like pagan activities that we see in verse 1 there, or verses 4 and 5. So because they're taken away, they're not going to have these feasts. Their current feasts are like these pagan activities in verse 1. They're going to be sent off to these pagan peoples in verses 3 and 6, where God's song, Yahweh's song, is going to be a distant memory. If you're taking notes, you may want to write down Psalm 137. Psalm 137 there in verses 1 through 9. Psalm 137, again, that when they're carried off to exile, God's song to them, it's going to be a memory. They're going to eventually have forgotten, just as we get between Malachi and Matthew, and there's those 400 silent years where God, well, he's silent. There's no prophets or what have you, so it's become a distant memory. Very quickly, Gary, do you mind reading Psalm 137? It's just 9 verses. Let's go ahead and read that very quickly. Because this threat of exile, it's been sounded before here in Hosea, in chapter 7 as well as chapter 8. But for the first time, it's kind of amplified by these big consequences that are coming for their challenger of worship. But Psalm 137.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sit down and wept. When we remember Zion, upon the willows in the midst of it, we hum our hearts. For there our captors demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirth saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget her skill. May my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. O daughter of Babylon, you devastate one. How blessed will be the one who repays you with the recompense with which you have repaid us. How blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes the little ones against the rock.
Thank you very much, sir. So that's kind of the idea here, is that when they're carried off to exile, they're taken to such a place that their entire calendar of worship is disrupted. They're not going to be able to have the festivals. They're going to lose a part of their national identity. And there's this lament because their captors are wanting, sing us songs of Jerusalem, of your homeland. And when they think of those songs, they were worship songs to God. They weren't there for entertainment value, you might say. Is that there was to be a deeper meaning for them. And we can even look at that today when we sing, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, and that there is a deeper meaning for them, and yet many create religious songs purely for the entertainment value, because maybe it's popular culture at the time or what have you. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as a popular hymn. No, don't take it that way, okay? But that's the idea. They're carried off, and Jerusalem and their homeland and their festivals, it's a lament, it's a sadness for them because they're not able to do that anymore. And they're going to get to this place mentally and spiritually where they're confronted with, what have I done? What have we done? Is now they want us to just sing like we're minstrels and what have you. And how are we able to do that? So he starts off verses 1 and 2. Do not rejoice, O Israel, with exultation like the nations, for you have played the harlot. Forsaking your God, you have loved harlots, earnings on every threshing floor. Threshing floor and winepress will not feed them, and the new wine will fail them. So the people of Israel, as we already know from the opening chapter of Hosea, they're charged with spiritual adultery. Remember? Their covenant with God, it was a marriage covenant. They were joined to him as their God, and they were to... What is something that you do when you get married? For your partner, what is it that you're saying? You're giving everything to them, right? But there's also in there the vow of forsaking all others until death do us part, right? So when we come into this idea of a marriage covenant, or this covenant between Israel and God, it is a marriage covenant in the sense that they were also to forsake all others, and that they were to remain faithful unto death. You might want to write Revelation 2 and verse 10 in there. Revelation 2 and verse 10, it talks about being in prison these 10 days, but then it says, but remain faithful unto death and you'll receive the crown of life. And so there's that, but they had become the harlot. When they set up idols, worshiped them, they fled to these other nations, they put their confidence in them, they went... As it says, I think in the King James, they went whoring from God as their God. They had hired themselves out at times. They had bought others, the friendship of Assyria and others. They had honored these pretenders. Other people were idolaters, but that sin was not necessarily in them at that time because they were a faithful people. But then at one point, 7-year itch, they decided to become unfaithful. And they were promised protection and prosperity and all of these things. And so they go with Assyria, and then everything is dried up. And it's dried up not necessarily because Assyria is using everything, but because God is taking it back. And he's going to take it back further by moving them into exile. Hosea, he urged Israel not to rejoice over this great harvest like the other nations. And part of the reason being is because these other nations like Assyria and others, they considered a great harvest to be the result of a blessing of their God, their pagan God. And it was to not rejoice over this great harvest, but just giving thanks to God for giving them what it is that they needed. Very much like the manna in the wilderness. When they had no food, said, okay, manna, it will rain from heaven. You gather up just enough. You gather up too much, it's going to spoil. Don't gather enough, you'll starve. So just enough there. But since Israel believed that the material blessings came from Baal, they had given themselves over to that shrine. They had committed harlotry against God, and there could not be any. How to put this? It's okay to thank God for blessings, and they should have been thanking God for those blessings, right? But because they had given themselves over to Baal, when they were being thankful, they weren't thanking God, they were thanking Baal like the other nations. So that's why there's this idea of don't rejoice over this great harvest, because their rejoicing is rejoicing in Baal, not necessarily in God. I want to make that clear. There's nothing wrong with, being thankful for what God has given. We're supposed to be thankful for what God has blessed us with. The difference, though, is that we might look at it as when they came out of Egypt during the Exodus. At first, they said Moses was the man who brought us out, but then they build this golden calf, and they say, this is the God that's brought you out of Egypt, and they started dancing around and all of this. So it's kind of it's very similar circumstances. They were thankful, but because they were in sin and worshiping Baal and what have you, their thankfulness was going to Baal and not to God. Does that make sense? Try to clean it up a little bit there. You have, it's got there, you have played the harlot, forsaking your God. You have loved harlot's earnings on every threshing floor. So each act of worship is compared to harlotry, in which Israel received their hire, whether it was wine, whether it was corn, or whatever. They had committed adultery against God, and they were paid well for it. Right? We see a lot today in prosperity preachers, for example. The sow a seed, reap a seed, and all that type of stuff, right? Well, they have forsaken God, and they're paid well for it. I mean, really, that's kind of the same idea. They have forsaken God. They've committed harlotry against God because of seeking these material blessings, and all that. And they're paid well. Here it was corn and wine and what have you, and they give thanks for it. Praise God for this 20,000 square foot house and all of this type of thing. And realistically, God is saying, don't bother giving praise for it, because really you're not praising me. You're praising the money that you're getting, and the money that you're earning, we might call it blood money. It's sinful money. Any thoughts or comments on that? Oh, okay. I didn't know if that was a throat clear or you were going to say something. You got to be careful. Mm-hmm. Why do it?
What was their mindset that they could build something and that themselves didn't worship it? Were they just not so smart people? Or I never understood how we could build something and then worship it. I don't know.
I mean, it's really no different than a lot of what happens today. See, when they looked out at Assyria being a great kingdom, mighty warriors, heavily fortified cities, outnumbered Jerusalem, and all of this, there was a great prosperity there that they looked at. And eventually, as we talked about in previous chapters, one of the first things that happened was the priests, they started, not all of them, blanket statements here, okay? The priests, they stopped teaching the truth. And so that filters out to the assembly. Then you have parents who weren't teaching the truth at home based on what Moses said there in Deuteronomy 6:4-9. And so it eventually just kind of the seed gets in there, right? If we were to compare that today, it's very easy for a smaller congregation, let's say of 50 or 60 people, to look down the road at a larger congregation that's got 500-600 people and say, well, what are they doing there? Okay, well, they've got this, they've got this, they've got this. These things that the Bible is against, and they're more mentally focused on what they can physically see. It's the exact opposite of faith. Faith is the substance of things, what? Hope for the evidence of things not seen or unseen. So they're focused on that. And that's the way that Israel was. They looked out and they saw all these physical blessings, and eventually they just reached that point mentally. And so it can happen, congregations look at other congregations, and I've known congregations who, even larger congregations, who have looked at others and saw the popularity. Anybody remember Max Lucado? Yeah. And, one of the most, at the time, prominent members in the church, I would even say. Dozens upon dozens of books, best-selling author, and all of this. And then he convinced some elders who weren't well-versed in the Bible, I'll say, even though they were elders. They kind of went this route, and that route started going downhill and went downhill, and a lot of people left. But yeah, it's focusing really more on the physical and not the spiritual. Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately, plain and simple, that's what it comes down to. The people can look, for example, at church growth, and they'll say, well, we're not growing. We've had the same attendance for the last 3 or 4 months. Okay, and I can understand that growth. But are those same people growing spiritually? Because there's growth there as well. Ultimately, what's the importance? So, but yeah, they just kind of reached that point, looking out, seeing more prosperous people, and said, yeah, I'm willing to compromise my values, my morals, and everything for that. Any other thoughts or comments, though? Yes, sir. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, he's still writing books and doing podcasts and videos and all that stuff, yeah. 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 Judges, people are faithful. They sin. Punishment comes. They repent. They're forgiven. They sin. Yeah. And believe it or not, if you were to study religious history, church history, even outside of the Restoration movement, just in how it works with the world and everything, and compare that to what's going on now, you'd be like, oh man, we already dealt with this 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or what have you, There are several books to get, like the Church of Christ during the Civil War, and dealing with things like slavery, and so there's all types of things out there. But yeah, we're repeating it too. White's Ferry Road was another one. White's Ferry Road in Monroe, Louisiana, used to be very, very big in the Brotherhood. If you haven't heard the name of them, you've probably heard the name Duck Dynasty. Well, that's where their family is from, and one of the sons/brothers is an elder there or something. I think they've taken Church of Christ off the door. I think they're just called WFR Church now, or something like that. It happens, though. Pride goes before destruction, and arrogant spirit before a fall, right? Verses 3 and 4, they will not remain in the Lord's land. So clearly spelling out exile. But Ephraim will return to Egypt, and in Assyria they will eat unclean food. They will not pour out drink offerings of wine to the Lord. Their sacrifices will not please him. Their bread will be like mourner's bread. All who eat of it will be defiled, for their bread will be for themselves alone. It will not enter the house of the Lord. So because of this apostasy, because of this rejection of God, this harlotry, this whoredom against God, Israel would lose its freedom. They are not going to remain, it says very clearly there, they will not remain in the Lord's land. And so that explains why all of this joy and all their sacrifices, legitimate or otherwise, is going to cease. They're not in God's land. They are in someone else's land. They are in exile. They are being told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and what have you. Now that's also, on the flip side, the same thing that God told his people that foreigners were to do. If a foreigner or sojourner or what have you were to come into Israel, bless you, then they were to worship God. They were to observe festivals. They were to do these things. So it's really no different, but now they're the ones that are in a foreign land. The land of Canaan was God's, not Baal's. Israel was just a tenant, allowed to dwell in that land on the condition of remaining faithful to the Lord. But since they had not met those conditions, what happens? If you're renting an apartment or a house or something, right? You have an agreement with the landlord of certain things that you're not supposed to do or that you can do, whatever. What happens if you start doing all of those things that you're not supposed to do? What do? They kick you out, right? You're evicted. They were in the land of Canaan that God had given them. It wasn't theirs. It was on loan to them. They were tenants. And part of that was that they had to be loyal to God. So they break this marriage covenant. So what ends up happening? They got evicted. You can just kind of look at it that way. If you have a married couple and they get a divorce, how often do they both stay in the same house? No. So, God... Sorry. So God says, this harlotry, we're getting divorced. Get out. Go. Don't let the doorknob hit you where the good Lord split you type of thing. Leave. And so, and that's because of their failure. And so Ephraim was returned to Egypt. Ephraim, Israel, not the land, that's not the land of Pharaohs, but it's a new Egypt. They shall eat unclean things in the land of Assyria. Assyria was the new Egypt. Okay? Assyria was the new Egypt. Since they wouldn't be able to observe their dietary laws, as you read of it in Leviticus and what have you, they're going to eat unclean things. Their food would be unclean. In exile, they'd have to eat food which hadn't been sanctified. They'd have to eat foods that weren't first fruits. But if you go through the book of Leviticus, it talks about specific dietary laws that they had to follow and laws of sacrifice, especially those first 5 chapters. But and they're not going to be able to observe those things, right? They are in a new land. Imagine, for example, if you were to take the Lord's people here at Freetown Road and, okay, you can't worship here anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you as a people and you're going to the cathedral down the road, this Catholic cathedral down the road. Okay? And are you going to be able to do everything there that you did here? No. You kind of have to abide by the rules that are set there if that's where you're going to be. It's really the same thing that God is saying, is that you were in my land, but it was conditional in the sense that you were faithful to me. You were unfaithful not only in joining yourselves to these foreign nations, not only in your priests rejecting my teaching and teaching falsehoods or not teaching anything. Your families rejected that. You built altars and made your own sacrifices. So now you're going to be taken out of my land. You're going to go into this land, this new Egypt, a.k.a. Assyria, and there you're not going to be able to have your festivals. You're not going to be able to have your feasts and your rituals. You're not going to be able to observe the dietary laws. You're not going to be able to clean the animals and bless them in such a way as you would have, though they probably weren't doing that before if they were sacrificing to Baal anyways. So very much the idea of taking God's people, let's say here at Freetown Road, throwing them, in a Catholic cathedral down the road, and then everybody at Freetown Road says, hey, we get to do the same thing. No, you don't. And that's what the prophet is saying here. You're going to be in someone else's land. You got a new landlord now, and he's got some different rules that you have to follow. So they're going to lose their worship privileges. They're not going to pour out wine to God in that land. Their sacrifices aren't going to be pleasing to Him. Israel, all they could offer were sacrifices to God at a place where the Lord had made known by His name that He had revealed Himself. So in exile, proper sacrifice would be impossible. Because remember, God says, at this place, this is where you will build this temple. This is where you will put the tabernacle. This is where you will set your tents. This is where you'll sacrifice. God chose everything. They're in a land of exile now. God is not choosing a place in a foreign land for His people to worship because they can't worship. So they're not going to be able to do anything like that. So proper sacrifice is impossible for them. In exile, their bread's going to be like the bread of mourners, so their food, it's like a funeral meal. It's not that it's not nourishing in the physical sense or filling their bellies or whatever, but that it's defiled. A person was defiled for unclean things. You might want to write down Numbers chapter 19 and verse 14. For the unclean things there. It's going to be for themselves alone. Not bread, nothing more. And here's the irony. The irony of this whole thing is that while they were in their own land, they had eaten sacrifices for their own appetite, forgetting God. In exile, they would not be allowed to eat for any other reason but their appetite. And so the bread in the foreign land, it's going to be common because it doesn't come into the house of God. So that's that common phrase. It's not going to be sanctified by the offering or what have you. The loss of worship would be felt most on the festival and feast days. The exiled Israelites, they'd miss the worship on those occasions. So they're not going to be able to do anything. And we have to be careful too. Same principle applies today. If we're not careful in following the Bible, and we just say, oh, it doesn't matter, God will be okay with this, even though the Bible says He's against it. It can be very easy that we end up as exiles. We don't think that way because of the way that the world is made up now. But it would be very easy for us to be exiles. It could be that secularism takes over. Christianity's the minority. Or even not secularism. The Islamic faith, that's the second largest growing faith. And we're the minority. You don't have to be strangers in a strange land. Right? You could be strangers in your own land too. So we have to be careful. Any closing thoughts or comments? We'll just go ahead and end it there instead of getting in. We ended with 4. We will pick up with verse 5 next week. And something that you may want to read over the course of this week are Judges chapter 19 through 21. So Judges chapter 19, 20, and 21. That's going to play a part in what we're getting into here with Israel. Those are the most, I'll say, brutal chapters in the entire Bible. having to deal with a man and a concubine who is brutally raped by the town. He cuts her up into 12 pieces and sends her out and all that, but we're actually going to be getting into that. Judges 19, 20, and 21. Those are the most brutal, to me, the most brutal chapters in the Bible, and they're actually often used in the month of October, because if I remember right, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So those 3 chapters are actually used a lot there as kind of a warning for women against domestic abuse as well. October, it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So there's a lot of congregations will actually preach on Judges 19, 20, and 21 because it is a good cautionary tale against domestic violence and what happens.